Hi students, and welcome to today's live IELTS class. My name is Adrian, and I am streaming to you from beautiful Budapest here, the capital city of Hungary, located in Central Europe. Welcome everyone. I hope you have had a fantastic week so far. Hi Daniil. This class is a task 1 line graph example, step-by-step structure and strategy. This is a members chat class. Everybody's welcome to watch. In 90 minutes, we will have an all chat class for a task 2 essay question. This is academic task 1. It's different from the general, so keep that in mind. Hi, Paranjay. All right, students. While we wait for some more members, a little bit about us. These lessons are brought to you by aehelp.com. That's academicenglishhelp.com for lots more help with your academic exam. Check us out there. And for the general version, look for us at GIELTS Help. That's generalieltshelp.com. On both of those sites, we have lots of videos and interactive course and practice exams to help you get higher band scores. Those websites look like this. This is the academic here, aehelp.com. Click that big red button to join our premium package, or you can try it free. Click the green demo button. Also, for general IELTS, look for a similar layout except with a green color motif. Again, click that red button to join us there. Great to see many more members jumping in on the class. Hi, Barendra. Kisi, good to see you. Haven't seen you in a little while. Hi, Roshni. Hi, Preeti. All right, students. So going back to our lesson here, you can download our app, Academic IELTS Help, from Android and iOS as well. If you have questions, send me an email, Adrian, Adrian, at aehelp.com. Preeti is asking, has the class time changed? Not in my world, Preeti. In Hungary, we do have daylight savings. Is everybody familiar with daylight savings? I guess in India and some other parts of the world, you do not have daylight savings. Daylight savings means that we change the clock forward or backward in time. In this case, we actually changed it backward 1 hour. So I guess it's a little bit earlier for you in this case. Okay, so that's daylight savings time. Good question, Preeti. Yeah, so class times are according to Central European Time, CET time, which does observe the daylight savings hour. It's according to time here, 13:30 for the members chat classes and 15 o'clock start for the everyone chat classes. Okay, Roshni's saying, no, it's 1 hour later for you. Yeah, right, okay. Yeah, absolutely, 1 hour later. Okay. Now it's 6, that's right, yeah. So we turned our clocks back, which means that it's 1 hour later for you. Or sorry, we turned it forward an hour, so it means that yeah, that's right, Barendra. We turned it forward an hour, so it's 1 hour later for everyone. In spring, we do the opposite. So springtime, we turn it back. Okay, so students, let's take a look at today's question. Task 1, here we go. IELTS Task 1, writing. First step, read the question carefully. Okay, so read the question carefully. You should spend about 20 minutes on this task. The following line graph shows the change in CO2 emissions per person in 4 different countries for a given period. Summarize the main features and make comparisons where relevant. This question is coming originally from Cambridge IELTS 11, book 11, okay? So here we go. Again, one more time. The following line graph shows the change in CO2. CO2 is carbon dioxide emissions per person in 4 different countries for a given period. Let's take a look. This is the graph here. What's my first step? Always, what do I do? So what's my first step? What's step number 1? What should I do? As always, step number 1, and I begin my essay here, is to, that's right, Paranjay, paraphrase the question. And remember, Paranjay, it's not just a paraphrase, we give more details. So that's already part of the overview. Okay, and that's kind of nice with this task 1, is that step 1 begins your essay and it helps you understand what you will write. Yeah. So the overview, it's roughly 3 to 4 sentences, and it's 2 parts. 1, paraphrase the question with more details, plus 2, express the most observable characteristic of the graph. Okay, table diagram. So let's do that. Paraphrase the question. The following line graph shows the change in CO2 emissions per person in 4 different countries for a given period. Summarize the main features and make comparisons where relevant. To get more details, always look at the graph. Average carbon dioxide, CO2 emissions per person, 1967 to 2007. Take note of the year-date range, how many years that is. We have 4 different lines representing 4 countries: the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal. Okay. On the y-axis, we have the carbon dioxide emissions in metric tons. And on the x-axis, we have the years: 1967, 1977, 1987, 97, 2007, obviously with intervals of 1 decade. That's 10 years. So go ahead, students, and paraphrase the question using some of this information to create more detail for that 1 or 2 sentences. I'm going to do the same. Okay. Staying a bit quiet to give you a chance for your own thoughts. Okay, so there's my sentence. This line graph illustrates the carbon dioxide emissions in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal per capita from 1967 to 2007, measured in metric tons. Okay, and grammatically, expressively, it It's a little bit more accurate to do it like this. Per capita means per person in this case. Okay. So, Roshni says the line chart depicts the statistics about the changes in carbon dioxide release in metric tons by each person in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal. Very nice paraphrasing, Roshni, and good attention to detail. Each one is understandable. I think each person is a little bit better worded, Roshni. But otherwise, very good, very similar to mine, just worded a little bit different. Paranjay, the line graph depicts the standard carbon dioxide emission of the population measured in metric tons in 4 different countries from 1967 to 2007. Paranjay, very nice paraphrasing. You didn't name the countries, but you don't have to. And that is also really nice paraphrasing with additional detail. Great. Kisi says the given line graph depicts the average carbon dioxide emission in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal per person for 1967 to 2007 with intervals of 10 decades. Kisi, just a missing S off intervals because intervals are countable. Otherwise, Kisi, a beautiful paraphrase with really nice lexical resource and sentence structure. For all of our viewers, if you're reading Roshni, Paranjay, and Kisi's first sentence here, the paraphrase with details, those are all very high band level, band 8, band 9 level starts to the essay. Okay. Danish says this given line graph depicts the emissions of carbon dioxide by each individual in 4 countries, comma, UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal for 4 decades from year 1967 to 2007. That's right, it's for 4 decades. The unit is measured in metric tons. Yeah, the carbon dioxide emissions are measured in metric tons, Danish. A little bit more accurate, okay? Danish, very nice. Some very nice use of vocabulary. Again, good job. I can tell that some students are really catching on for what you need to do to get those better, higher band scores. All right, now let's take a look at the actual line chart and let's identify the main observable feature. What is it? So what's the most observable feature from this line graph for per person carbon emissions 1967 to 2007? Okay, what do we notice mostly? While you're thinking about that, I'll read a couple more of the first lines. Zainab says the line graph depicts the amount of radiation carbon dioxide per person for countries in the UK. We can't use the word radiation, Zainab, in this case. It's awkward. I get what you're saying, like radiating instead of emitting, but radiation of carbon dioxide, it's a little bit tricky because carbon dioxide is a molecule and radiation is confusing. It can be taken negatively. Hi, NA. Welcome to the club. Make sure to send me an email and I'll send you your perks. So Zainab, try to choose a different word, okay? So here we go, Zainab. The line graph depicts the amount of carbon dioxide emission per person in the countries UK, Sweden, and Italy, and Portugal from 1967 to 2007. Instead of emissions, Zainab, if you really want to paraphrase that word, release is a better word, okay? Preeti says the trend of the line graph depicts the CO2 emission per person in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal from 1967 to 2007. Nice paraphrasing, Preeti. Good job. Okay. Daniel says the line graph displays some carbon dioxide emissions per citizen in 4 countries like UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal for the period 1967 to 2007. Yes, Daniel, use affirmative language. Not some carbon dioxide emission, but just carbon dioxide emission. Not countries like UK, but countries UK, Sweden. Those are the countries. Okay. Roshni says UK and Sweden, so this is the mostly observable feature. UK and Sweden carbon dioxide emission follows a downward trend, while Italy and Portugal increase. Okay, so yeah, we can definitely notice that there's an overall. Careful students, when you see this kind of a spike up and a down, it's very important that if you say that there's a downward trend for United Kingdom and Sweden, that you mention that it overall. So overall, there's a downward trend for United Kingdom and Sweden, while for Italy and Portugal, there is an overall upward trend. Okay, that's fine. Let's see if anybody had a different mostly observable feature. Yeah, so Preeti says Italy and Portugal constantly increased. UK had the highest CO2 release. So yeah, Preeti, that's where you got a little bit shook up is, do I talk about the highest and the lowest, which is very interesting because even though United Kingdom is decreasing, it's still the highest in any given period. And Portugal only here in 2007 becomes similar to Sweden. Otherwise, Portugal is the lowest. So that's another interesting observable feature here is you have the high and the low, you have the decreasing and the increasing. I would agree that the most observable feature is probably this one here and this one here. That overall, United Kingdom and Sweden decreased carbon emissions during these 4 decades, while Italy and Portugal increased emissions. Okay, so let's write that piece of information to wrap up the overview. Okay, this is where the word overall is very important. Overall tells your reader that you're talking about the entire date range. Okay. And to make it even clearer, name the date range. So this is why I didn't name the 4 decades earlier, because I wanted to use it here. So overall, in these 4 decades, both Great Britain and Sweden decreased CO2 emissions, while Italy and Portugal increased their CO2 emissions. Okay. Emissions is a little bit tricky to paraphrase. You can say released or produced, okay, instead of emissions, but you might have to change the grammar if you're paraphrasing with those words. So here is my overview. The line graph illustrates the carbon dioxide emissions per capita in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal from 1967 to 2007, measured in metric tons. Overall, in these 4 decades, now notice how I use a comma and another comma. That allows this leading expression and this time expression to be additive. These commas are important. Okay, both Great Britain and Sweden decreased CO2 emissions, while Italy and Portugal increased their CO2 production. if I don't want to repeat emissions. Okay, just be very careful of word form. There we go. Okay. Paranje, it looks like you have a similar approach. Overall, it is evident that the average emission of people living in the UK and Sweden has decreased, while that of Italy and Portugal has increased over the 4 decades. Yeah. And when you're writing about line graphs are continuous. So you can use the progressive form of the verbs as well. So you can say overall in these 4 decades, both Great Britain and Sweden had been decreasing or have been decreasing. Had been because it's the past. Make sure that you have parallel grammar. So if you're going to use past perfect progressive, make sure to use past perfect progressive as well for the other point within the same sentence. Past perfect here is better than present perfect because the graph doesn't continue until today. If it would show today and the future, you could use the present perfect, but in this case, past perfect. Now, yes, you do pick up points for using more complicated, higher levels of grammar, especially when you're using it correctly. Okay, so overall, in these 4 decades, both Great Britain and Sweden had been decreasing CO2 emissions, while Italy and Portugal had been increasing their CO2 production. Okay, that's your higher level sentence. Now, when you're practicing task 1 and task 2 at home, members, do what I just did. So go through the same couple of sentences, look back, think about the graph, think about whether it's a line graph, pie chart, what kind of language and grammar is appropriate, and keep working on increasing the level of expression and your writing to improve your band score. Does that make sense? That tip? I think a lot of students, they tend to write many different task 1 responses, and they don't spend time to review and revise the same task 1 over and over to see how well they can develop their essay to a higher level. And that's really important, okay? It's a faster way to achieve a higher level of authorship or literacy. Okay, so that's my tip for members and viewers today, is make sure to frequently review and revise your task 1 and task 2 essays, not just for mistakes, but also for grammar and language improvements to increase your communication and literacy. Okay, it's very important. All right. So, some good sentences there, students. All right. Danish says at first glance, it is noticeable that UK is represented as the highest carbon dioxide emissions, while Portugal is the lowest producer of CO2 during these 4 decades. Okay, so yeah, you could go that way, Danish. You could say that that's the most observable feature. Now, after the overview comes the body paragraph, which is the analysis, right? So body, and the body is the analyses. Okay, if you put an I there, analysis, it's singular, analyses is plural. We're making multiple analyses here, anywhere from 5 to 8 points, depending on your skill level and the graph. Okay, let's do that now. So let's take a look at this and let's discuss the points that we need to include in the body paragraph. What would be your first point of discussion? So, Barendra, Kisi Danish, Preeti, what would be your first point for discussion looking at this line graph? What would you say is a good place to start? And say, okay, I'll go with this one, number 1. Okay. So Danish says, let's start with UK because it's the highest. Yeah, I would do that. I think that makes the most sense. Okay. So I would start with the UK because it is the highest and it's the highest in all periods. So this line would be my first description here. Okay. So that would be my first. All right. What would be my second? So number 1, UK. That makes sense. Number 2, Barendra says the lowest. You could do that, Barendra, but I actually wouldn't. For my second point, I would agree with Roshni that I would discuss Sweden. So I would talk about this. And for point 2, you're going to have several. So point 1 is just this one trend. But for point 2, you're going to have 2 to B. Let's call this first one 2A. So I'm going to create some sub points here. You'll see why. So we'll go 2A, 2B, and then 2C. Okay. So Sweden does definitely have an interesting trend compared to these other 3 lines. Okay. It's the only country that has this significant change here. I'm going to ask you for the vocabulary, and then another change in another. So there's kind of a 2A, B, C here. And then I would probably go 3 for Italy. And then I would go 4. And for 3, I would probably do an A and a 3B here. Okay. And then I would go 4 for Portugal, all the way to here. Okay. I hope that makes sense. And we'll discuss each of these step by step. So first, let's just take care of United Kingdom. So United Kingdom is roughly at around 11 metric tons of CO2 in 1967. And then in 2007, it's at around roughly 9. Okay. So write that first piece. Discuss that for me. Okay. Paranjay says, in the beginning of the period, United Kingdom had the highest emissions from the 4 countries, averaging close to 11 metric tons per person. Good. Keep going, Paranjay. It's a good start. So I would say that in all, not just during the beginning, Paranjay, so all right. So UK is always the highest. There's no point that any other country actually goes above the UK. So you probably want to be clear about that. That is an interesting and important point, that even though the UK is decreasing slightly or gradually their CO2 emissions, they are still the highest, even in 2007. Okay? That's an important point. You can. So Danish is saying, can I just compare lowest to highest between United Kingdom and Portugal in the beginning? You could do that, Danish. Although Danish, you might not do that until the summary. You could wait until the summary as well to make that comparison. So again, more than one way to skin a cat, Danish. There's more than one type of compare and contrast, but yeah, you could. Okay. You could also do a comparison, Danish, between the UK and Sweden. Okay, there is a contrast there also. Okay, NA, good to have you in class. So NA says Sweden had a significant rise in CO2 emissions during 1967 and 77, and then a steep decrease between 87 and 97, which gradually fell for the next 2 decades. NA, not bad, okay? When you have this kind of a depiction in a graph, okay, think about the stock market. What do you call that? So there's a really nice piece of vocabulary to express that very simply. What do you call that? Okay. It's not a tipping point. It's not a peak. Barendra is going full technical analysis, a resistance point. No. There's a simpler word for it. In the spirit of Halloween, today is Halloween, there's a piece of wood used to kill vampires. Looks like a pencil. What is that piece of wood that's used to kill vampires? Yeah, very good. So Raghu says, is it a stake? It can be Raghu, but in this case, we're looking for the synonym, which is used by Kisi, and that's a spike. Okay, so yes, you're right, Raghu. It's a stake that's used to stake the vampires. The verb is stake as well, but another way to call it is a spike as well. So spike or stake. Yeah, okay, and in this case, we're looking for a spike. So just remember that spike, okay, used to kill a vampire. All right, that's my Halloween anecdote for today's class and my Canadian cultural spirit of Halloween. All right, so let's describe that line for Sweden, and we can compare it. So Danish, you can compare Sweden to United Kingdom because look at Sweden. So Sweden spikes and then it rapidly declines and actually becomes even less by 2007, equaling the lowest. So in 2007, Portugal and Sweden are equally the lowest two carbon emissions, right? So you can have that comparison there as well, Danish. Okay, let's write about that, and it will be absolutely clear. In contrast, Sweden to CO2 emissions or production per person had a sudden spike and decrease early on, and then continued to, I don't want to repeat, So here I'm using gradually, so I want to use a synonym, okay? Continue to steadily decline, becoming the lowest producer of carbon dioxide in 2007, along with Portugal. Now, in fact, I'm just playing it safe, but you can almost see if I really zoom up, then you can almost see that Sweden is actually starting to fall below Portugal. So there's a very slight crossover here at the end, but it's negligible, so we're not going to go into that much detail. We won't be that picky. It's fine like this, definitely a band 9 level writing so far, okay? So Roshni says, as stated, in 1967, there was an incredible discharge of CO2 in the UK at 11 metric tons. However, in 2007, this trend shrank to 7 metric tons. Roshni, the irregular verb shrink, shrank, shrunk. Okay, shrink, shrank, shrunk. All right, Paranje, while Sweden saw an initial fluctuation, the emissions from these countries had decreased by 2007 to 9 and just above 5 metric tons respectively. Paranje, the last line and a half of your writing is a little bit confusing. Consider revising that. Okay. NA says, during 1977, Sweden spikes and almost has equal CO2 emissions to that of UK, while Sweden manages to bring its CO2 levels down to appreciable limits. UK is not so successful. All right, NA, I think you have a lot of ideas there, but it's too much information. Okay, so you're trying to put too many ideas into a very short sentence and it becomes confusing. Consider breaking that up into 2 clear sentences. Okay. Berendra says UK and Sweden increased, then decreased, but Italy and Portugal always had the lowest CO2 emissions. Berendra, again, too much information. Students, be really careful with line graphs. Don't try to explain too much in one go. I think that's a very common mistake that many candidates make, is they try to compare too many points all in one go. I definitely, Berendra, would not compare 3 countries in one sentence for this line graph. I think that's very confusing. Okay? At most, I would just compare 2 for this particular line graph. Comparing 3 is ill-advised. It's not a good idea. Kisi says there was a spike in Sweden's CO2 production in the first 10 decades, and then this continued to decline to be the lowest in 2007, which is equal to that of Portugal. Kisi, very good. Okay, it's very close to what I wrote. Zainab says, after looking at the 40 years, it is noticeable. Students, it's present tense when you're talking about the graph now. So for somebody looking at the graph now, it is noticeable that UK has the highest emissions with 11 tons in 1967. And this decreased, okay? So when you're talking about the years, it's past tense to 8 metric tons in 2007. Zainab, you cannot leave out words like metric in this case, because 8 tons and 8 metric tons are not the same, okay? Metric tons is the volume of CO2 emissions. Tons is the actual weight of emissions. So you have 2 different concepts there. You have to be careful. Otherwise, Zainab, that's wrong information, okay? That would be a lot of CO2 if it were actual physical tons. Okay. All right. So students, again, so far, this is what we have. In this 40-year period, UK has the highest CO2 emissions, starting at 11 metric tons in 1997 and gradually decreasing to 9 metric tons by 2007. In contrast, Sweden CO2 production per person had a sudden spike and decrease early on. So I don't name the years here. I just say early on. Or I could say in the first 2 decades, okay? It would be more accurate, I agree. And then continued to steadily decline over the next 2 decades, becoming the lowest producer of carbon dioxide by 2007, along with Portugal. Okay? All right. So now let's discuss Italy. Okay, what's going on with Italy? Now, Italy has this kind of step ladder or staircase style line, but it's not very pronounced. It's just kind of a gradual increase or a steady increase from just over 4 metric tons to nearly 8 metric tons by 2007. Now, one point that is kind of interesting for us is this here. How do we express that? So in our writing, how do we express this event for Italy and Sweden? Okay, and that event falls right at about 1987, maybe a little bit after. Yeah, very good, Preeti. It's surpassing. Okay, surpassing. So use the word surpass, S-U-R-P-A-S-S. Surpass. Surpass means one goes above the other. So good job, Preeti. Yeah. The correct vocabulary is surpass. So students, write the description for Italy and express that there is an event here where Italy surpasses Sweden. Okay? I'm going to do the same and then we'll compare notes. Okay, here we go. So, Italy was the third lowest emitter of CO2 in 1967 at just over 4 metric tons. Nevertheless, because I believe I used however before. No, I used in contrast, so I use however here. However, due to its consistent increase, it surpassed Sweden around 1987 and became the second biggest producer of CO2 at nearly 8 metric tons by 2007. Okay, now that's quite a complex sentence. And again, members, students, if you're not comfortable or confident that you can write a sentence this complex, break it into 2 simpler sentences, okay? while on the exam. So in the official exam, if you're not sure that you can deliver this type of writing, don't try it because it might be confusing, grammatically incorrect, and your score will go down. In that case, break it into 2 sentences. However, at home, definitely work to increase your skills and eventually reach this level, because in college and university, you will be required to produce that level of language. Okay? So Paranji says, on the other hand, countries like Italy and Portugal showed an increasing trend, the former emitting almost twice the amount of CO2 than Portugal, and had surpassed Sweden's emissions around 1987. Paranji, very good. Okay, just careful capitalizing Sweden and use the apostrophe to show possession. Sweden's emission, right? Big S apostrophe. There's 2 mistakes in that word. So careful. Raghu said, Italy being the 3rd lowest initial producer in terms of CO2 emissions, it had a constant increase when it surpassed Sweden in 1987, making it the 2nd highest towards 2007. Very good, Raghu. That's some nice wording. Okay, excellent. Good job, students. I have to keep going here. I definitely want to finish this up with you, so if I missed yours, don't worry about it. We're going to come to Portugal. Now, Portugal is the one, of course, that begins the lowest, but there's definitely a very consistent increase. I mean, Portugal, in some senses, almost a sharp increase, right? They're going from 1 or just over 1 metric tons to a multiplier of 5 by 2007. Okay? So I can almost say a word that I can use for Portugal is a fairly rapid increase, okay? So last one here. Although Portugal is distinctly the lowest producer of CO2 in 1967 at just over 1 metric ton. Its emissions increased fairly rapidly, becoming more than 5 by 2007. Okay, so even though it's still the lowest, and we've talked about that, I don't need to repeat that. I said that it's the lowest with Sweden. Its increase is kind of alarming because it's very rapid. Now, it does kind of steady here in this year, but I'm not going to go into that much detail because it is the IELTS exam, and I'm not writing a 500 or 1,000 word analysis for a university paper. So I'm not going to break it down here. I'm just going to talk about the overall trend. Okay. All right. So I have that. Now, if I have time, I'm going to add a summary. And again, at this point, a summary might not be necessary, but I'm going to add one just to make sure that I can get that absolutely nice high level band score that I'm looking for. What can I summarize about this? So what is a good way to summarize this information? What have we learned from this graph? So taking a look at these 4 lines, what can we notice? And keep it simple. So I want to hear your feedback here. What is an observable summary that we can draw from these 4 countries and their carbon emissions? that we haven't talked about yet. So the summary is not necessarily just a repeat of the rest of the essay. We can kind of paraphrase, again, some of the essay, but it's definitely not a repeat of the overview. So we can summarize that all of these countries, yeah, absolutely, very good. So Danish says all of the countries experience a very observable change from their start to finish. And that's right, Danish, that's a very good observation. So in summary, we can see that all of these countries over these 40 years experience a very observable difference in the production of CO2 per capita. So Portugal, and that could be up or down. So Portugal from 1 to 5, Sweden from 7 to 5, UK from 11 to 9. So there's some definite change in these numbers, okay? So Paranjay says, to sum up, the emissions from Mediterranean countries were identical as opposed to countries like Sweden and United Kingdom. That's okay too, Paranjay. Very nice, Kisi. I love Kisi's summary. So Kisi says that the emissions from these 4 countries per person are beginning to converge. Converge is a really nice vocabulary, Kisi. So Kisi's saying, look what's happening, ladies and gents. If we stretch these lines, then what's actually happening is it seems like we're reaching a point of convergence. Convergence is where all of these lines and this data meet. And it's no surprise. Think about globalization. Think about how cars are becoming similarly efficient and similarly emitting carbon dioxide. So we can't say that because we don't see it, but that's probably the reason why. And Kisi, that's a very, very good observation. So in summary, it is notable that the per capita emissions for these 4 countries are converging to around 7 metric tons per person. Okay, that's definitely, it's a very interesting summary. So in summary, the data indicates that the CO2 emissions per capita is converging around 7 metric tons per person. Okay, that's very, very clever. No, Danish, you should not write from your own opinion. This is not from my own opinion. You can actually see that trend. So you can see that conversion. You should definitely not write that it's probably because we're all starting to use the same kinds of automotive and industrial technologies. We don't know that, although it's probably the truth. We can't say that because it doesn't show us that information. But we can see that there's this funneling effect. So there's definitely a convergence there. Okay, that was a good question. All right, so let's read this full essay and make sure it makes sense. This line graph illustrates the carbon dioxide emissions per capita in the UK, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal from 1967 to 2007, measured in metric tons. Overall, in these 4 decades, both Great Britain and Sweden had been decreasing CO2 emissions, while Italy and Portugal had been increasing their CO2 production. In this 40-year period, UK had the highest CO2 emissions, starting at 11 metric tons in 1997 and gradually decreasing to 9 metric tons by 2007. In contrast, Sweden CO2 production per person had a sudden spike and decrease in the first 2 decades and then continued to steadily decline, becoming the lowest producer of carbon dioxide by 2007, along with Portugal. Italy was the 3rd lowest emitter of CO2 in 1967 at just over 4 metric tons. However, due to its consistent increase, it surpassed Sweden around 1987 and became the second biggest producer of CO2 at nearly 8 metric tons by 2007. Although Portugal is distinctly the lowest producer of CO2 in 1967 at just over 1 metric ton, its emissions increased fairly rapidly, becoming more than 5 times this amount by 2007. In summary, the data indicates that the CO2 emissions per capita is converging around 7 metric tons per person. Very good. Okay, that's great. That's it for this lesson. Now, in 30 minutes, we can continue the writing section with writing task 2. Great job, members. Big thumbs up to all of you. I loved the sentences that you were putting out into the chat. There was some fantastic composition there. Hi, Amarjeet. Daylight savings, classes forward 1 hour, okay? All right, students, again, check us out at aehelp.com for the academic IELTS and gieltshelp.com for the general. Download our app, Academic IELTS Help, from your Google Play and Apple App Stores. Link it with your web account for a truly awesome, anywhere, anytime IELTS learning experience. Hopefully, I will see all of you in 30 minutes for an exciting writing task 2 topic. Bye for now.